Hello everybody, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Lucy Long's Green Bean Casserole and Midwestern Identity, a regional foodways aesthetic and ethos. And if you thought that I was going to talk about Lucy Long's Green Bean Casserole article and not make you green bean casserole while doing so, then you have not been paying attention. So I have laid out all the ingredients before me. It requires, this is according to the website, and you're going to see the lovely images to my right anytime now. Probably, am I rolling it now? I think I'm rolling it now. Here we go. It requires 1 can of cream of mushroom soup, green beans, and 2 cans of this size will suffice. You can use fresh, obviously. You can use frozen if you have thawed them. But I just decided to use these. You need, the secret ingredient is the fried onions. You need a dash of pepper. You need a teaspoon of soy sauce, and you need half a cup of milk. So we are going to be putting all this together. And this is a wonderful article. So it expresses so much, because typically when we talk about traditional foods, obviously, one of the things that we tend to think about are non-industrial, pastoral foods. When we think about foods that are, and doubly so when we think about foods that have to do, with place, we think about the foods that are grown there in large part because of this concept of terroir. Terroir is a gastronomic term, and it's more or less the idea that the food that is grown in a place retains something about that place within it. That there is something about the actual the literal, how to say, the fact that it came literally from the ground it's more simply than the scientific realization that yes, it was created in that soil. It's almost as if the soil has transferred something about the local identity into that food. It's particularly important in terms of wine and region, and you have a lot of interesting debates about what you can call an authentic Bordeaux, for example, is because the grape might be consistent from iteration to iteration, but only Bordeaux that is grown within Bordeaux, France, is what can truly be called Bordeaux. We hear that there's the joke about champagne, and but a very real idea. It's an interesting dynamic because there was a blight in the late 1880s in France, and what really was able to restore the vineyards were the fact that most of these varietals had started to be grown in Australia and California. So they were able to, once the grapes had been attacked in France, they were able to be rediscovered, reintroduced thanks to these transplants. And yet all of a sudden, France wine people started to say that, well, the California types weren't authentic, and it was only the stuff that was grown locally, despite the fact that these grapes were actually descendants of ones that had landed in California and had been grown in California. So it's an interesting idea. But terroir speaks about naturally grown foods. And of course, this, as you can tell, I mean, we'll skip over the idea of milk, but the Campbell's soup especially, and the onions I'm about to add especially, are clearly not locally grown, so that they kind of transcend the idea that we typically think of when we're thinking of traditional food, and doubly so sort of local identity foods. It's difficult talking and cooking at the same time, unless you're only talking about that which you are cooking. All right, so I need 1 teaspoon of soy sauce. Pew, 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 pew. And I don't know what constitutes a dash of pepper. Elsewhere, Long says that one of the appeals of it is the remarkable absence of spice, or at least the simplicity of the spices. So I'm just going to do 4 cranks and hope that that is somewhat appropriate. Oh, I put the soy sauce bottle right in front of the camera. Well, just two more for show. And stir, stir, make sure everything is stirred around. My father made something like this. His was a broccoli mushroom casserole, but basically it was the same basic idea. Yeah, basically it was basically. Forgive the redundancies. So this is, I have a feeling that even though the preparation is going to be a little bit fraught, as you see it right now, the actual taste is going to be something that I feel quite familiar with. All right, and the last ingredient are the onions. I'm supposed to have 2/3 of a cup now, and then when I am done the initial baking, 2/3 of a cup into. These are a lot larger than I thought they would be. But, okay, that's 1/3. Yeah, that works. And then I will arrange, when it's done, I put more on top and cook it for another 5 minutes. So I stir everything in, apparently. So green bean casserole was invented by the Campbell Soup Company. This is not some ancient food, and it requires industrialized ingredients, as so many of our 20th century foods do. But it was easily and quickly incorporated into Midwestern food habits, and becomes a required part of it. And so this article is basically exploring that phenomenon. How did this come to be, and what is being expressed? When we talk about food sort of having some kind of performative aspect, what is being expressed in green bean casserole? Now I am just going to pop it into the oven. Set the timer for 25 minutes. You might see some clever editing in this video where all of a sudden this time shrinks, but I'll keep it as realistic and cinema verite as I can, because that's what you pay me the big bucks for. There will be an edit here. Did you miss me? Good. So one of the things that she is trying to explore is this really interesting idea about, well, what does green bean casserole fulfill? I mean, what is it doing? Why is it so very prominent in Midwestern food repertoires? You see it in the cookbooks, you see it in community cookbooks, and you see it basically everywhere. It's almost like a function isn't a function unless green bean casserole is there. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is liked. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is celebrated, but it is conspicuous when it is absent, which seems to suggest something. And she has this neat idea about Foodways aesthetic and Foodways ethos, and that foods often do two things, and sometimes they will do one and not necessarily the other. But the Foodways aesthetics is basically the group's sense of what tastes good, what looks good, what feels good. I mean, literally feels good in terms of things like texture, but what feels good in terms of comforting or soothing, or so that other levels of feeling. And then there's sort of the Foodways ethos, the moral and social values that a particular food might represent, and the values attached to food and eating to begin with. So like sociability, reciprocity, displays of what? Displays of cultural values that might be in place. And so to explain the ubiquity, to explain the cultural love of green bean casserole, you need to go beyond simply, this is what those people who are perhaps defined by the lack of taste or lack of culinary refinement, this is what they like, and say, okay, there's probably an intelligent and creative thing that, or role that green bean casserole is fulfilling. So just to sort of give a certain amount of context, she is talking particularly, and many Foodways readings that are done by people who teach at universities, there's this wonderful pool of informants, for lack of a better word, that are available in terms of student projects and student insights. Much folklore work is done through students collecting and reporting on their own communities. And Foodways is a perfect example of that. And so this is in the Bowling Green State University, and it's part of in Ohio, Northwest Ohio, not too far from Toledo. Was its own community, now is essentially just a suburb of Toledo in terms of like the agricultural region that used to separate them has now been filled basically with suburbs and affordable housing. It's primarily, the university student body is primarily middle or lower middle class, working class families from the region, mainly from that catchment area. And the students are often the very first people in their family to go to university. So it's they are close to the working class, middle class, industrial, agrarian background. So one of the first things she asks is whether this is simply because of the hard life or the hard scrabble life that they might have been leading, whether this was simply because it's an expedient and incredibly simple thing to make with inexpensive, easily attained, year-round attained ingredients that are going to be commonplace. The most exotic thing, I guess, is probably the French fried onions, and second would be the soy sauce. But again, reasonably common. So is this simply a concession to speed and something that can be quickly and easily prepared? It's like, no, because even on occasions that don't are festive occasions, ones where one of the things about the meal is the expectation that it will take a long time to prepare, that it is a sort of feast of some description, like Thanksgiving, green bean casserole will be on the table as well. So it isn't simply this sort of concession to expedience. So it is, but it fulfills fulfills a certain number of characteristics or a certain number of requirements that one has for food. It is it's inexpensive, as I said. It's dependable. It's very easy to make. It's easy to transport. You put it in a casserole, if you have casseroles with a lid, and actually that one has a lid. The very one I'm using comes with a little snap-on lid. So it's designed to be shared. It's designed to be something that one can bring to a potluck or bring over to someone's house if someone is sick. It can be the contribution to a collective meal. And so on. So and that's something that people seek out when it's there. But it also has a certain amount of aesthetics to it. It's crispness, it's thickness, the snap, probably with the fresh green beans as opposed to the can that I'm using. And it is a comfort food with its textures and tastes. The comfort food is in part because it is so familiar. I mean, it's that reciprocity. If it's been there all your life, you might have some kind of comfort associated with it. And even the people who don't like it or actively are repulsed by it still recognize it as part of the set of expectations. Like they mark themselves as distinct from what they themselves understand as the norm. Now they might be marking themselves in that way as a form of status seeking or status claiming, but fundamentally they're just like, yeah, I know it's a weird thing, but again, it's conspicuous when it's not there, and they sort of appreciate the somewhat ironic place that it has. So Northwest Ohio is part of the larger Midwest, the region of the United States, after the 13 original colonies, 19th century colonization. The dates are a little bit fuzzy because my history is a little bit fuzzy. Primarily agrarian, but not necessarily couched in the romanticism of the small-scale pastoral farm. It always been agriculture that was part of industrial agriculture. Even the small farm unit was about getting things to market, as opposed to, you know, tending one's own soil for one's own self. So not a, I mean, you know, we'll still honor and celebrate the idea of the American farmer, but as part of the larger American industry. So the you know, the breadbasket of the United States, or, you know, and also, you know, associated, you know, in the southern parts of the Midwest, like Kansas and so on, with cattle and the like, but not a romantic viewpoint of it. So, but very much seeing itself as, and having projected upon it, this sort of sense of the prototypical middle America, the almost non-ethnic, although the ethnic backgrounds of the region are multivaried and diffuse. You note in her description, and it's probably because of the unfortunate accuracy of the description, the conspicuous absence of First Nations in as sort of notable actors in the area, mainly having to do with European immigrants, first Western European, then Eastern or Northwestern European, and then Middle European and Eastern European. There are African American communities, there are Hispanic communities, and so on. But kind of that sort of thick whiteness, especially once one leaves the urban areas. Where that kind of ethnic identity, for the most part, is not necessarily erased, but played down in favor of this sort of Midwestern ethos. So that, I mean, they certainly do celebrate that aspect of being part of Middle America, and the idea that, you know, locally, both sort of emically and edically, the idea is that the food is sort of simple, but simple is a positive virtue. Plain, hearty, meat and potatoes as sort of a metaphor for a no-frills kind of food. And it ties into the notion that that food should fundamentally be thought of more as fuel and less as an effete aesthetic event. Now, of course, that is something that is projected onto the food and projected onto the ethos of the food, and that isn't. I mean, that clearly isn't the case. Clearly, tastes are enacted. There is, you know, flavor is a fundamental value that people are pursuing, but perhaps the diminishment of food in the local narratology of food is indicative of something. So food is evaluated by its energy-giving qualities rather than by aesthetic ones related to refined tastes. And so I don't think it's, I think the key aspect in there is refined. The idea that it is meant to be palatable without necessarily trying to suggest something sophisticated. That being said, the preference for simplicity over the sophistication is in itself a statement. It is sort of like the costume of no costume, or it's sort of the simplicity is therefore a mark of authenticity, as opposed to simplicity is just the default mode that one has because one is too busy. One is performing being too busy in this context. Nevertheless, the food is very fuel driven. It's high calorie, high in carbs, high in fat, high in sugars. And one of the things that ties it quickly back into the casserole is how important canning is locally for local horticulture, for local produce, and that people have been canning for a long time home canning at the very least. So the idea of using canned vegetables or prepared foods is already a long-standing familial thing. So whether it is their own cans or their own pre-processed foods, or whether it's the pre-processed foods of industry, which have been around for decades, if not literally centuries at this point in this region, it doesn't really matter. It's not considered an intrusion into the way food ought to be prepared. So green bean casserole becomes a celebration of technology. The very fact that things are available in cans, and the very fact that it is basically an assemblage of mostly fresh produce, mostly pre-prepared goods. It's only really the milk, because I mean, the green beans might be in season; they might be made fresh, but for the outside of season, that they could be from their own canned situation. Canned green beans are a common enough vegetable in Northwest Ohio and in the Midwest that, yeah, you would have these cans of beans. So whether you are using the cans of Green Giant or our compliments, or conversely you are using the cans of that you yourself prepared 6 months earlier when it was canning season, doesn't really matter. The other aspect, yet another aspect, is the idea of the casserole itself, which started more or less as an elite food in the 19th century because it required a certain amount of refined ingredients and time. And one of the things that Campbell's introduced was, with condensed cream soups and so on, and then developing recipes that could extend the soup beyond its use of a soup, was to take this prior middle upper class food and democratize it by making it something that's quite easy to make. We see that happen a lot. The history of Jell-O is similar. Jell-O was in the 19th century a very elite food because it required the rendering of gelatin, and it was a very long and time laborious process. And so gelatin desserts were the sign of like ultimate refinement. Then when I think General Foods, I'm blanking right now, I believe it's General Foods, introduced, and Knox introduced instant gelatin, commercially available gelatin, all of a sudden that elite food could enter into the middle classes. And it was something that was accessible within the more limited time constraints of people who didn't have a household of servants to help them with their desserts. So all of a sudden, and then through the introduction of cookbooks, they could be made, how to create and how to show one's creativity in the kitchen through Jell-O could be demonstrated and spread. And then so there's some very sort of gauche sites that will often talk about, like in the 1970s and Jell-O salad and all the sort of strange Jell-O things. Well, that was sort of the tail end of the golden age of Jell-O, but it was sort of the last lingering embers of this elite food that had entered into the middle classes. Now, for the most part, we associate Jell-O as either a food of poverty or of two sort of lumpen groups: children and seniors. Those two ends of the extremes outside of the mainstream. And then we also, because we associate it with childhood, we associate it with licentiousness, and so Jell-O shots and Jell-O wrestling and so on. It's the naughtiness of sort of a matter out of place, where sexuality or alcohol and a fundamentally childish thing should not coincide, and then they coincide and everyone's having a time. But the casserole, it not only is it a good dish in terms of it's something that could be brought out to a table, it suggests guests. I mean, you don't eat, I'll be eating it because I'm all alone in this world, but you don't eat a casserole by yourself. So it already denotes hospitality and sharing. It is something that is brought to a festal table or a communal event. And so it is it serves that good, and there are already casseroles as part by the mid 1950s when green bean casserole was invented. There were already casseroles as part of the regular food habits of the Midwest. So this slotted into that in a way that was quite peculiar, because green bean casserole typically implies a protein. So whether it's chicken or whether it's tuna, you understand what proteins are. That's sort of almost, constitutive, because a casserole should be a meal replacement because it has vegetable and protein and one other thing, starch, and this is just vegetables and two vegetables, I guess, mushroom and green bean, but somehow it's able to fill it in anyway. Some of this has to do with the legacy of Campbell's Soup, who one of the major industrializing or major industrial food corporations emerging in the late 19th century. And we have to also remember that from the perspective of the early 21st century, mass-produced industrial food has been denigrated more or less since the late 1960s and the emergence of the counterculture. So when we think of processed foods has a negative connotation to it, and we sort of poo-poo processed foods unless they come from elite makers, and that we fall for the basic marketing. So particular store brands, they might introduce something. In Canada, we have the President's Choice that's associated with Loblaws and Atlantic Superstore. In United States, you'll have sort of Trader Joe's brands of food, and so it's still processed. It's just it's just filtered through elite snobbery. But industrial food is something. At one point in the late 19th century, and through much of the 20th century, processed foods, industrial foods, was seen as a fundamental good because it was standardized, because there were people who were responsible for ingredients, because there was reputations at stake, because there were stockholders at stake. And so when you opened up a can of Campbell's Soup, you knew that the ingredients that were on the label were going to be what was inside. You knew that there was someone that you could appeal to if something was wrong. And you also had this idea that every can of soup is going to be fundamentally the same. And that is a value. That is something that you can understand. It's later when we start, again, sort of this countercultural movement in the late 60s and early 1970s, where we start pushing away from the idea of the processed. One, having to do through developments in science, where we're thinking that, well, maybe like the canning process and then the various other refinements that food goes through before it's able to be shelf ready is actually detrimental to us. So we shifted away. That's when brown bread became a thing again. After brown bread had basically just been for the poorest of the poor, all of a sudden it became a countercultural food and is now sort of like as common, if not more common, than white bread. White bread is still obviously around, but white bread now becomes this sort of metonym for lacking in sophistication. Oh, so fairly white bread tastes. But so much of North American food companies, I can just list them over and over again: Green Giant, Kellogg's, Lay's potato chips. Just name and you keep going. Coca-Cola. They were the consistency of the product, the industrialization of the product was valued, and that is still valued in many places. It's an act of elitism to immediately dismiss them, or to think of them solely as a lack of sophistication. They might be no longer avant-garde or of the current thinking, but nevertheless they are part of It's only a generation or so behind, as it were. Another aspect of green bean casserole is the fact that it allows for variation. We love variation in folklore. And so you have this basic structure, and then on the websites or in community magazines and community cookbooks, when the recipe, which, again, like an item of folklore, it quickly eclipses the original person, the original creator. And even though legally they can claim inventor status, it enters into the vernacular culture and can be adapted. And as intelligent people can adapt anything in terms of an item in a repertoire, they can adapt it in a way that still meets the expectations, but is demonstrative of individual tastes or individual ethos. It's been 25 minutes, at least, of filming, if not necessarily a final edit. So give me a second. Alrighty. Okay, so it's looking something like this. And now I take another 2/3 of a cup of the onions, and I add them in. All right, not knowing what I'm doing, because some people say the fancy pattern is important. So I'll measure. They do not pour easily. I think these ones are meant to sort of be eaten as a snack or something. I don't know. Do not want to use my fingers to pick them out of the thing. Although I immediately am going to use my fingers. So what do? I'm going to just smoosh them a little bit. I'm going to drop them on top. Look at that. Look at that. Oh yeah. I'm not necessarily patterning them, but I'm trying to ensure a certain amount of even coverage. Oh, there we go. I'm beginning to understand the appeal. Now, back into the oven. For another 5. So, back to variation. We have this standard structure, this expected structure, which is no different from the expected structure of Cinderella. But we can still introduce our own originality to it. I was slavishly following this recipe, which we will often do the first time we attempt to introduce a new item of repertoire into our repertoire. First time we bring it into performance. Subsequent to this, I might make changes. And again, the websites will, you can see other people commenting, and this is what I do. I switch it over, blah, blah, blah. It's really great. I add this, blah, blah, blah. If you want a lighter version, blah, blah, blah. And so they're already sharing this. And, you know, and this is part of its appeal, is that you can take this thing that is expected and nevertheless make it your own, introduce some kind of variety to it. Increasingly important is the idea of familiarity. So as these various quotes say, it represents the familiar, mundane, and everyday, in that it is thought of as an everyday convenience food, yet it also represents the festive, in that it is closely associated with potlucks and holiday meals. At such events, the casserole acts as a bridge between two realms, connecting public and private domains, making co-workers like family, and making family relationships somewhat more formal and ceremonial than they might otherwise be. And there is this aspect of play to it as well. Again, like Jell-O, there's this sort of it's recognizably something that is lacking in sophistication, as it were. Sort of that reflexive notion that you know that somewhere someone else might be mocking you for at the very idea of you eating this, and you can see why, yet you are doing it. You are doing it willingly. In other contexts, you might be doing it defiantly, but at least in this instance, you are doing it willingly. You know, but again, a lot having to do with its lack of sophistication. So again, like Jell-O, you know, as you're eating it, you're aware of things. It seems to suggest, and she doesn't explore this, but I think more than anything, it's just time restrictions. There are probably family stories about green bean casserole. Probably there's family stories about bringing green bean casserole to a situation where it was not expected or met with looks askance. You know, Midwesterners who happen to move to Washington State or something, and so that would be an interesting avenue to explore. So one of the things that she suggests is that the various meanings of green bean casserole constitutes the sort of series of binaries. That it is, on one hand, it is public, it's commercially motivated meanings. It's there to sell soup. It was introduced to sell soup, and is introduced in part, I guess, also to sell the French fried onions, and cookbooks and so on. It is part of that apparatus, and yet it has private, personal meanings because it has been used. Because it has been used in the family, because it has become the familiar. It has become the not simply the familiar, but the familial and important to the aspects of family. It comprises a tradition if it's been around long enough that it becomes something that to eat it is based in part, or to eat it or to prepare it or to expect it is based in part on precedent. Then it has entered into the tradition, despite the fact that it is not, at least through one framework, traditional in terms of being solely from the fruits of the land or solely associated with some kind of ethnicity, or all the various questionable ways and keywords that we can associate with the idea of tradition. It can be part of a regular weekday non-celebratory meal, because it would be very familiar, but can also be part of something that's festive and celebratory. It is incredibly plain. Again, simple ingredients, yet somehow, thanks to the juxtaposition and moving those together, it's also fairly fancy and fancy. And it has, you know, I mean, because it comes from a corporation, it is national, but it also has regional aspects. Now that's been 5 minutes. Let's see. Nope. Okay. Again, I'm beginning to see the appeal. Voila. So let me just move it back in front of me. This will be interesting. I am going to let it cool a little bit before I throw myself down, but I will be eating this before the end of the video. So one of the so that's its meanings. It's series of binaries. It expresses the local Midwestern, or so regional, foodways aesthetic. The reliance on processed canned foods, much like people who live in seasonal climates, who have an agrarian background, who understand the concept of canning and preserving foods, have lived on, at least for half the year, on preserved foods already, so it's not that big a deal. And also, you know, processed foods. And Campbell's is a local company, so it's something that is also a point of regional pride. A lack of spices. It is not a particularly exotic in terms of the tastes. That there is an emphasis, a value placed on hearty foods, on heavy foods. A fairly conservative approach to new ingredients and new tastes. When variations are introduced, they are fairly straightforward. You can use the golden mushroom or the cremini mushroom as opposed to the regular cream of mushroom. You could perhaps replace it with broccoli florets as opposed to green beans and so on. Okay, sure. But, within a still fairly conservative bandwidth. Some of the things I was reading, and I think can't remember now if I was reading it on the website today or on Long's article, but the idea of like adding water chestnuts and so on, all of which are variations. They're still within a particular curve. But that doesn't mean that you can't. It just means that they don't introduce increasingly arcane varieties of it. And there's also this sort of pride in well-crafted, functional dishes. That the fact that it is economical, the fact that it is efficient, the fact that it is easy to make, that it is not particularly time-consuming to make, is a value that is being celebrated and that is being communicated through green bean casserole. And then what is the ethos? That it lends itself, like we should be doing with food, particularly at festal occasions. It leads itself to communitas, the sort of its humility, its simplicity is non-hierarchical. Everyone can enjoy this. It is accessible. No one is superior. No one is more of a gourmet, as she says. It cuts across classes, at least in the Midwest, that it is not denigrated, but it is accessible to the working classes and the upper classes alike. So again, it is participating in that middle American idea of sort of the heartland, the center of middle class, middle American, authentic, simple but not simplistic values, where plainness is a virtue, as it were. And so not simply is the food accessible. All the ingredients are accessible. There's no barrier to entry, just like America. She has this one sort of final thought. The meanings associated with the casserole suggest that in Midwestern culture, food functions not so much as cultural capital, but as social capital. It is used to build and affirm relationships in the family or community rather than to demonstrate status. In this culture, valued foods and valued eating experiences are those that bring people together and that erase the social distinctions of class, gourmet tastes, and individualistic preferences. Green bean casserole does just that. So as you're reading this, it would be interesting to see if there is a food that fits into that same category in your home community. And if there isn't, maybe that level of performing social capital through food, that communitas aspect, isn't necessarily part of the ethos of your community. Maybe it is a sort of a regional, maybe it isn't a universal, that it is something that's expressed by region. It'd be interesting to determine that. A neat thought experiment. So, let me try this. This is apparently 6 servings. So I'm going to cut out, as it were, about a 1/6 of this. Okay. It's liquidy. I presumed as much. I didn't think it would bake into something firm. Let's see. You're not going to watch me eat the whole thing. Don't worry. So this is kind of what it looks like when it comes out. Let's see. Now, the taste. The proof is in the pudding. Ah, it's very green beany. Okay. Next time I would make this with fresh, or I would make it with thawed frozen. I don't think I would do the canned again. But it's actually not bad. I can see it. It does have that sort of thickness to it. It is, that creaminess is fine. The fried onions are interesting. It gives it that texture that would otherwise, it really would sort of just be gloopy. I think to eat it, you kind of want to have at least one fried onion in every mouthful just to sort of find something to latch onto. At the very least, given that these are canned and not fresh. Maybe if they were fresh, they would still have a little bit of the al dente to them. But no, I would give it a solid B-. And I'm sure in the eyes of a master cook, it is a lovelier dish. So anyway, that is that. We have been talking about Lucy Long's green bean casserole and Midwestern identity. As always, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well, eat well, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.